Hi, everyone. This is Margaret Manning with lifeafterdeath.com. Lifeafterdeath.com is a community for people like you who are interested in issues related to spirituality, life after death, the afterlife, and other topics of that nature. And we talk with an open mind and an open heart. My guest today, though, is Linda Fitch. Linda is a teacher, a trainer, and a shaman. She has worked with Inca medicine men and women in Peru and has been a teacher of shamanic medicine, energy medicine for over a decade. She is the developer of Dying Consciously Teacher Training Program and has taught thousands of students in shamanic healing techniques. She has a passion for transformation and wants to make a difference in the world. And I'm so happy to have you here, Linda.
Thank you, Margaret. I really appreciate being here, and I'm delighted to share whatever we're going to talk about today.
Well, what we're going to talk about is what you know best, which is shamanism and how it relates to a conversation around life after death. Now, the people in our community are fascinated by this topic, and we are interested in how to start with, shamanism practices help you to deal with death and grief. So how would you say that your practices, and maybe take a minute at the beginning to just tell us what shamanism is, and then we can go further to how it relates to death and afterlife.
Absolutely. So for anybody that's listening that isn't familiar with shamanism, it is actually every religion. Shamanism has been talked about that it's been around for 20,000 years. Mm. Every religion has roots that go back to shamanism. Yeah. Shamanism is in every continent in the world. So these roots, before Buddha was Buddha, he practiced Bampo. So these shamanic roots go far, far back. And it is a way of sitting with spirit. It's a spiritual practice. All the religions fit within it. I've taught Buddhist monks. I have taught elders from the LDS Church. I've taught Catholic. Everything fits within it. It's like this deep, far, far back. And it's that how you walk with spirit. So that's one of the things. It's a direct relationship with God, which from your background is not always a safe place. But it's a place of power, and it's a place of bringing our service into the world. And the word shaman actually comes from Russia, from Siberia.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So, but in other countries, it's called the medicine man, medicine woman. If we were in Africa, they would be called witch doctors.
Okay.
So North America, medicine man, medicine women, the healers. Sometimes they're called the curanderos in the community. So because it comes from all these different continents, it has little different flavors. So there'll be, certain practices, but the core part that every single one of them has is an ability that they train in to be able to leave this container and to go in other realms to be of service for the community. It's all based on service.
Okay. So let me just understand. So shamanism is really a concept, and you're going to talk in a minute about practices, things that you do in the shaman tradition, which are those healing practices, which these medicine men and women would do. And I love to just, channel in on specifically what it is about the death experience and how you prepare for death and how you deal with loss and grief in the shaman tradition.
Yes. And it used to be shamans were called, like they'd have a near-death experience. And that's how you were called to be a shaman. But now lots of our listeners are called to the same kind of spiritual path. They've had an awakening in the hospital. They've had something where so many people are called to that place to be of service and to walk a spiritual path with it. So part of the shamanic teaching is that you work with death, and that you work with death so it becomes an ally. Wherever they're from, every single practice has death as part of it. You have to go through your own death. But as anybody that's actually gone through a near-death experience tells you, it's very difficult on the body. So what shamans do is they practice it through other techniques. Malidoma Some from the Dogra tradition in Africa, part of his tradition, he was given a choice to dig a grave, and you either dug it this way. It was either horizontal or vertical, and you spent the night outside in your own grave with your head up above. So, or you could go on journeys. So part of what it does is we make an ally with death, And as anybody that's had a near-death experience talks about, it's this place of it changed your life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what
Mm-hmm.
you want to do, is you want to have that life-changing experience while you can still come back to a healthy body.
So that's a really interesting concept, though. It's like using the physical body to actually, or putting it in a situation, either through like a practice like you just described with the grave, or you're finding a way to transform the experience mentally as well.
Right.
Yes,
And it's letting all those things die. And it's shamans use their gift that they use a lot is journey. So which means that they'll journey out of the body and they'll go through their own death experience. Or, it's that ego that holds us. How do you let go of the ego so you can, that's the hardest thing, I think, when we die. So,
well, how do you do that? I mean, do you meditate? I mean, how does a shaman prepare for that?
Meditation is an awesome practice. And I started my spiritual opening doing TM meditation. But shamanism is more active. So they'll actually go on journey. So it's not just sitting in the ocean, it's actually where you determine where you're going and work with that. So some of the practices, there's a journey you can do where you actually let go and surrender to all those things that hold us. There's other journeys you can go where you actually go with death. And we want to have like death can sit beside us because it'll keep us honest. It's not really work that's important. It's the family and the kids that are important.
Yes. So that's really fascinating. So when you sit down to do this practice, do you make a conscious statement like I am going to sit with death, and then you sit in a group, or do you do this as an individual, or both?
You can do it either way. When I teach classes with it, I'll take the group onto a death journey, and I typically will use a drum. So some of the tools of the shaman are a drum and a rattle. And what it does, the beat of the drum changes your brain waves. And it puts you in that upper theta brainwave where the images come in, where you can actually journey through. That's why one of the reasons why shamans use drums is because scientifically, it puts you in that place of easily being able to journey out.
So chanting or drums or anything kind of that, like you say, just sort of stimulates that's neuro-linguistic programming that you teach. It's that changing the brain waves. So that's interesting. And then, of course, the medicine man presumably uses different medicines or herbs or spices or natural products. So
depending on which culture it comes from. Right. So some traditions, so I take groups down to Peru, and we do work with one of those that's called the Vine of Death, that actually helps you, it like propels you huge into this place of looking at those places where, because when we come down to death, it's really that unfinished business that holds us and stops us. So there are, but it's not a given. Most traditions just use a drum.
So let's go back to a comment we talked about earlier about grief, because every time I'm sure, well, I know it happened to me, every time I sit down and think about dying or about death, I actually start thinking about loss and about sadness and grief, about what people will do without me, heaven forbid. You just do that with your ego. It's just a natural thing. So talk a little bit about how grief plays into the shamanistic tradition, how you deal with it.
Well, and from the shamanic tradition, what they recognize is that grief is just part of life. And it's in our Western world where we've taken grief and we've kind of put it don't cry so much. You go to your bedroom if you're going to cry. Yeah. And most indigenous cultures, they recognize death and grief is just part of it. That we lose loved ones in the same way that we lose dreams. We lose futures. So how do we deal with this place of grief? And there's a beautiful woman I studied with, Malidoma Some's wife, who, Sambumfu, who talked actually about 12 different kinds of grief. And it's from the head, it helps to recognize, I'm dealing with a complicated grief. My mom, and I hear this number of my clients will say, my mom died, and then I got really, things were really busy. And then my husband left me. And then my dog died. And then all of a sudden they're caught. There's just too much in there. Or another kind of, the earth holds a lot of grief. Little islands, like that little island in Ireland, there's so much grief from the past that's held because of the loss. that was there. So locations will hold grief, land will hold grief. Sometimes family systems will hold grief, and this will make sense. So even in sometimes that we'll have, if there's a lot of grief in a family, they'll actually look for a spouse that can come in to help heal the grief. And the spouse, I have a good friend that did this, works and works and works and works, could never heal that deep, whatever issues were in that family, and then ended up getting divorced.
So where does that consciousness exist, though? I mean, you said the land and a family can hold this grief. How does that manifest itself? Where does it live? How does it work?
Oh, this is so good. And hopefully some people are going, oh my gosh, right now I've got a client that is, they got a home and a piece of property from her mother. And so and they said, Linda, every time we are there and we're just filled with sadness. As soon as we leave, even if we leave the property, then I can feel, my life comes back, my vital life. So sometimes it shows up like that as we feel this sadness that, a lot of people that are probably listening are more enlightened, and we always think it's us. Oh, what's wrong with me?
Yes.
Oh, what popped up? Versus going, oh my gosh, where am I touching grief?
Yes.
Where am I walking with grief? And sometimes we learn as little people, 3-year-olds, to pick up somebody else's grief because this is the way the family does it.
Well, children pick up emotion, don't they? I mean, they're incredibly good at that. Well, no, the reason I was sort of asking more about that is I think that what you're saying here seems to make perfect sense about a fear of death. If you've got a fear of dying, it's because your mind has got an attachment to a negative concept. And if you can change the way you think about that grief, like you were talking about that couple with the land, if they could change their mindset, that it wouldn't affect them anymore, or they could move on, or
it's
how does
both.
that work?
You work on the mindset part, but then there's actually shamanic practices where you can clear the land and you can clear the grief out of your body. So that's like the journey where you let all of those old things go. We want to, if Joe Dispenza was here, we want to talk about, there's genes we can turn off and genes we can turn off. So so we don't age the way our mom had to age, that we don't have to get the illnesses that our mom had to get, that we can have a different way of death. We want to pick the way that we're going to die instead of having it be the genetic way or karmically. We let go of the old karmic pieces.
It's really, really fascinating. I mean, we're talking about practices here, and we've covered a whole range of things. We talked about physical practices where you dig your own grave and sit in it overnight. You talked about practices where you're using some kind of chanting or drums, and you talk about practices now where you're actually doing, well, I guess not magic, but cleansing exercises that certain people have the power to do. Not everyone does. How do you become a shaman?
There are actually, so in the past, because, now we're in our modern day with all of our internets and stuff, it's so cool. Yeah. And I actually offer classes in person, online, journeys to Peru. And you can learn that way. In the olden days, before we had all this place of connection with it, a lot of shamans would get through dream time. They would think, they would have visions that would come down. Sometimes they would sit with their uncles, with their grandpa, that was taught within the family. Yes. That there was an elder in the family.
Wisdom was transferred, yeah.
Yeah, grandma was the one, the wisdom keeper, and that would help teach that. And I would encourage everybody listening that you really look at that. It isn't, again, I think so many people are more open and enlightened than they've ever been. And that's the beauty of having this electronic age and to share that wisdom, pass that on, to share that.
I think we've covered so much here, and we're going to do a series of videos, and we're going to cover this in a much more depth in other talks. But I wanted to focus this time on practices that can help us deal with death and grief. And I think you've done an excellent job of doing this. But I would refer you people out to your website too. It's Linda L. Fitch, lindalfitch.com. And I'm assuming you've got lots of really great content and articles out there that go deeper with this.
And Margaret, I do. And there's one thing I would like to make for everybody that's listening in is there's a beautiful practice that I learned from the Dogger tradition from West Africa. Okay. And in that shamanic tradition, what they use is a grief altar. And it actually is a physical thing that you create in your home. It's got a dark bowl and a dark cloth, and you put salt and you put water and you put candles with it. And what that does is it'll actually pull the grief out of your body. Because a lot of times grief, we don't want to open the door because it's so big, because there's so much old grief in there, or there's earth grief, or there's, something that we didn't deal with when we were 10 years old or 12 years old or 13. So the grief altar allows us to open the door, allow the grief out, and then be able to close the door. Because that's what a lot of people are afraid of. If I open that, then I'm just going to get sucked in.
So where do you open this? In your mind? I mean, how do you do this? You say anything or think?
You actually make an altar.
Yeah.
And I've worked a lot with altars as part of, it's in all religions, again, goes way, way back to shamanism.
Yes.
And when I first did this altar, I was grieving and crying, and then it was gone. Wow. To the place I was shocked. I turned around and looked over my shoulder like, where did it go? Where did the grief go? It's that powerful. It'll pull. It works in homes. It works in buildings. And I'll send you the URL so you can let your listeners know that.
I would love that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a little video that shows me that shows how you make one.
I would love to share that, because a lot of people in our community are older people. Thinking about their mortality becomes a natural pastime. Sometimes at 3:00 in the morning, a lot of people find those ghosts, come to visit you, and the grief comes back when in the nighttime. And I remember reading a book about this where it says, I think it was called The Force of Character, and it was about how you should embrace those moments, because that's a chance to deal with what it is that you're, like the door you don't want to open. Right. So maybe this is a nice time if you have that altar. So yes, share. Yeah. Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I have learned so much, and I hope it's been of help to the people watching. But go to Linda's website, lindalfitch.com, and stay tuned for more fascinating conversations. Thank you so much, Linda. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our Life After Death YouTube channel and visit our website at lifeafterdeath.com. We are a community of people who are fascinated by the topic of life after death and subjects like near-death experience, the afterlife, reincarnation, and spirituality. Together, we are exploring and discovering these topics together with curiosity and an open heart.